Rebels, here back with our series, How to Win the World. And today we are delighted to have author, pastor C.R. Wiley on recording with us to talk to us today about Christian households and a lot of great things. C.R. Wiley, if anybody who's listening doesn't know him, wrote one of the best books of the last 10 years. I'm not even overselling it. In the House of Tom Bombadil. All of our listeners should have already read it, but if you haven't read it, pick it up, buy it off them directly so he gets all the money. But C.R. Wiley's in the house. Nate, why don't you tell the people who we are?
Yeah, so this is the Rebel Podcast for cultural engagement. It's a ministry of the Ezra Institute, and we are also part of the Fight, Laugh, Feast network. Pastor C.R. Wiley is also on the Fight, Laugh, Feast network with the Theology Pugcast, so you can catch his and all of our episodes on the Pub TV app. And we would encourage you to become a club member as one of the many ways to give back to the show. But we want to kind of jump right in. We're in this series, How to Win the World. And the idea of this series is that we want to look at practical things or the outworking of theological ideas and concepts that Christians ought to take seriously if they want to see the world around them transformed by the gospel. So we all know that salvation begins individually, but we want to go beyond just that and get into some of the nitty-gritty stuff on what does it look like for Christian communities to take certain practices seriously to try to be a positive force of change in the world around them. So first of all, Pastor C.R. Wiley, thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
For anybody who's listening and maybe isn't familiar with some of Pastor Wiley's work, the three kind of resources that we're going to be drawing from today in terms of picking his brain are Man of the House, Household and War for the Cosmos, and In the House of Tom Bombadil, which Chris already mentioned. Three books of his, which I think work really well together. I read them years separated, and each one sort of advanced some of the thoughts that have been very helpful for me as a pastor, as a father, as a husband, as the head of my household. So we would recommend all those resources to you. But today we're going to kind of pick your brain a little bit about those resources and draw on some of your knowledge. And I guess my first question, just to kind of put this conversation in context for our listeners, is we read a lot in the Bible about commands for households, whether it's roles, responsibilities, hierarchies, all that kind of stuff, delegated responsibility by God. And yet when we hear the term household, we're sort of ill-equipped unless we do a little bit of work and study to understand everything that, whether it's the Apostle Paul or some of the Old Testament writers, are actually talking about. So talk to us a little bit about what was a biblical household, and when Paul's talking to households, what is he talking about that wouldn't naturally come to our minds?
Oh, that's a great way to set it up. I think what we've lost sight of is the purpose. So sometimes we get lost in the details. Like you noted, we understand the structure, we understand the roles, but we don't know what it's all for. And one of the reasons why it's hard to sustain those structures is we don't know what it's all for. So, you just kind of are doing things because, you say, okay, the Bible said so I'll do it, but I don't have any sense of what I'm up to. And that's the reason why one of the reasons why we're having a hard time sustaining households. But a house in antiquity was the fundamental institution that served as like a building block for a culture, a civilization. And that's true everywhere in the world. You can go to India, you can go to China, you can go to the ancient classical world, and you see the same way of looking at things. So the reason that's so is because prior to the Industrial Revolution, the household was the primary productive agency or institution in the society. So the term economy is an English word that is derived from two Greek words, oikos and nomos, meaning house law of the house. And the law of the house was intended to support the productive enterprise of a household. So when a husband and wife were joined in marriage and established the household that they would live in, they were also working together on a daily basis, doing things together. It could be everything from running the farm to running the cobbler shop. There were just a lot of different things you could do. And so households were, of course, places where people, welcomed children into the world and enjoyed recreation and stuff like that. So it wasn't just work, but we live in a world today where most of the productive activity has moved out of the house, and the only thing that's been left behind is the recreational stuff, and even less and less just daily things that people took for granted in the past, like making a dinner. We just order out for pizza or pop it in the microwave, that kind of thing. So, everybody's in their little separate room with their little screen and watching their own individual little thing. Even when I was a kid, at least the television would bring you together because people generally only had one.
That's right.
But now that's gone.
Some of the things that the Bible commands us to do within our homes are also things that have sort of moved outside the home now. You talked about the Industrial Revolution and how much that changed households in general. And so, some of the responsibilities that I think over the last 3 years with everything that was going on, a lot of pastors started talking about sphere sovereignty. A lot of our listeners are familiar with that term. The idea that God has all authority and he delegates it to various spheres. And one of those spheres is the sphere of family government. And there are a bunch of things that the civil authorities have sort of swallowed up in terms of responsibilities that at different times were delegated to the family. I'm thinking of things like education. I'm thinking about things like welfare. So maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the things that were primarily in the home prior to the Industrial Revolution and now are no longer there. So you talked about, our individual rooms and it's sort of separating the family. But what were some of the God-given responsibilities to a household that have primarily been taken outside and given to the civil authorities?
Yeah, well, there's a kind of logical progression when you think about the fact that the most productive member of the household was the father. He oversaw its activities, and then he was farmed out literally to a factory. Initially, entire families moved into the factories. That's what the child labor laws addressed initially. You've probably seen photographs of boys who were in the mines, or maybe little girls with their mother next to a big loom, a machine in England or something like that. So initially everybody moved into the factories, and it made tons of sense because families had always worked together. And then people realized, okay, this is not good. We need to separate these functions. So we're going to lionize the domestic sphere. And that's when you had kind of the cult of hearth and home of the 19th century develop. And there were a lot of good things about that. I'm not saying anything derogatory about that. But what ended up happening is that because of the voracious appetite of the industrial economy, eventually women were taken out of the home as well. And what do you do with what do you do with kids? Well, you have to institutionalize them. That's what public schools are. Literally put them into another institution and let somebody else raise your kids, take your aged parents, put them in a nursing home, let somebody else take care of your parents. And it made sense because, okay, all of my productive activity is being spent in these other places. Who's going to watch the people in need? So social welfare initially was a really fundamental part of a household's economy. And generally speaking, the women took care of that side of things. But when the women left home, obviously somebody's got to watch the kids and the old folks. So that's how that all kind of played out. But in antiquity, you didn't have that. You basically in antiquity, if you think about, say, the New Testament, essentially the only two institutions that would take a man out of the house for extended periods of time were the priesthood and the army. And when that happened, the extended family had to kind of step up and help out to take care of, the people who weren't at home or were left at home. But those were basically the only two places where you went, unless you were a slave. So things are a lot different. But I think, over the last few years, people are kind of second guessing the logic of the whole thing and trying to bring stuff back home. And there's a lot of, I think, positive things that are going on in our world today along that line.
Wonderful. Pastor Wiley, what would you say is like some of the first steps to taking some of these things back? So you mentioned education, social welfare, business, economy. what are some practical steps that Christians can do right now to start to bring these things back? I know it'll require sacrifice, but what can we, like, day one on the ground start doing?
Well, I think people with kids generally are uncomfortable with public education, and if they can't afford private schools, they bring their kids home to educate them. That's, I think, in most cases, the first step. And then after that happens, people, put two and two together and say, well, maybe we should bring grandma home too. Yeah, grandma, she's just kind of sitting in a nursing home right now. She could actually help watch the kids and that kind of stuff. And then, at that point, often, a father will say, "Man, I wish I was around a little more," and he'll think about what can I do out of the house that would be productive in the market economy. And so I've got lots of guys I know who are, something like software. Is a field where a lot of guys, and I've got guys in my church. I probably have a dozen guys in my church. I'm not exaggerating, who are software guys who are at home, and they're interacting with people around the world, and they're traveling. I mean, they're doing stuff. They're not just like holed up in a third bedroom somewhere, a converted office, but so they're getting out, but they really do cherish the ability to be with their kids a lot and to oversee the development of their children in ways that a father can do that and a mother can't. So, and often when it just kind of develops organically. At some point, some guy says, there's something I can do that, and maybe they can't do it full time, and that's fine. But they're just kind of. You get to the point where you're thinking, I want the household to be more productive. And when that happens and people are working together and you're not trying to do make work, like I think a lot of chores that kids perform in the home is make work and they know it. Like mom will say, make your bed. And you says, why? I don't mind a messy bed. But if you're actually working on something, on another scale, another level, let's say you've got, just to keep it simple, let's say you got a farm, somebody has to go out and bring in the cows. And if he says, why? You say, well, because the coyotes will eat them if you don't, or something like that,
That's really good. I think when we start thinking about things to task our children with, because this was the thing, right? It used to be, we've broken things down in such a way that in order to be sort of classic, traditional, conservative families, we say, okay, the wife ought to be at home and the husband ought to go and work. But in trying to recapture that, we're actually trying to recapture that the Bible, something that the Bible doesn't actually prescribe, because family work was the household work, right? This is why children generally followed the vocation of their fathers, because they'd been doing it since they were young, right? And this is why the Proverbs 31 woman, it's not that she's working independently and starting a business outside the home, it's that she is part of the household economy. So this kind of goes back to something that you said right near the beginning, is that we've lost the idea of what households are for. And so we're not just talking about bringing these things back because that's what households look like when Paul was writing to us. We're talking about taking these things back because it's actually a better way of forming a strong family, and strong families are at the center of God's rescue plan for the world. So, how does involving your children in productive work and all that kind of stuff, how does that begin to reap eternal rewards in terms of what it builds within the family?
Yeah, I'd love to get into that. But before I do, I'd also like to just note that it's better for a civilization as well. One of the things that we're seeing around the world is population collapse everywhere. Yeah. For example, South Korea, I think, childbearing women are averaging less than one child, wow, in terms of bringing a child. So they're in a huge problem, sort of. In fact, I was just looking at an article in the Wall Street Journal today, noting that the Russian military adventure in Ukraine may fail not because of a lack of resolve, but just a lack of people. The population of Russia has been in free fall for decades, wow. So they just don't have enough young men to do what Putin wants. I'm not trying to justify the war. I'm just saying, you kind of the sexual revolution will kill itself. You just give it enough time, it'll kill itself. I'm not concerned about Pride Month. I think in about 20 years, Pride Month is going to be looked at as just one of those weird, stupid things like we look back at the 1960s and say, what were they thinking? I think we're just going to look back at it and say, it died out because it was stupid. But I think when it comes to fruitfulness, and our long-term perspective, when we think about eternal rewards and just even the work of the kingdom in our immediate environment, I think that households are at the center of it all. Even when we think about the church is understood as a household, the household of God, and in some sense, our households in a small way reflect that larger household. So if you think about, Christ and the church, a groom and a bride, right? And it wasn't as though the Apostle Paul was fishing for an illustration when he noted the connection in Ephesians between our households and the God's household. What he actually said is, no, our households are a reflection of that household. We're not just like projecting our way of looking at the world into heaven. Actually, it's the other way around. Heaven's projecting itself into the world in the form of our households. So the duties that husbands and wives perform have a larger, you could even say, heavenly or even metaphysical character. And that's what I was getting at in Household Warfare for the Cosmos. In my first book, Man of the House, was intended to be just kind of a handbook, very practical. But then I thought, people need to see that there's another dimension to this that's the big picture. And that's what was behind that book.
Yeah. I think that one of the things that we've lost is we've lost the idea that a strong household is kingdom work.
Right.
And so that's the great purpose. Build that, and then your vocation, all the produce that you do out of that in terms of if you're a loom maker, a cobbler, or whatever, is the means that we build the kingdom with, not the purpose of what we're doing. And I think people have lost that idea that if you have a lot of kids and you're a great father or a great mother, that is kingdom work. It's not secondary to the work of being a missionary, but somewhere along the lines, and I'd love to know your thoughts in terms of when you think that happened. The switch happened that it's a lesser job to be a stay-at-home mom or a dad, who works in the home or whatever. I think we sometimes have elevated he's a missionary, he's more spiritual than the father of two who homeschools his kids, right?
Right. Yeah. I think there are a range of things that come into play with that. One of the things is the industrial economy really is a remarkably productive thing. There are things that we can accomplish working together on large scale that we can't as households. Let's just, we're not going to send anybody to the moon, from my garage. Right. That's right. That's right. So, but the problem is that we've failed to see the kind of the trade-offs. Or I think maybe people in the past did maybe have a better understanding of the trade-offs. Like when I read stuff that was written in the late 19th century, early 20th century, they understood the trade-offs. But then we completely lost sight of those trade-offs. So that today, I don't think anybody thinks along these lines. I mean, I remember when I was a kid, I would hear politicians talk about households and families and things like that in a way that we would recognize. Today, no one talks in those terms, and the reason is because, I think there are a couple of sides to this. One is that there is a social dynamic that Plato noted. He said, "What's honored in a country is practiced there." It's a great line. So if you want to know why people do what they do, it's because they receive recognition and honor for doing that. That's what the Pride Month is all about. It's a way of promoting the sexual revolution and honoring deviance. we're surprised that we have more deviants than we used to. No, we reward those people with attention and praise. That's why we have more. But when it comes to another thing is that there's a kind of a short-term thinking. If we're sort of focused on the quarterly report, we lose sight of the long-term objective. And if we're always focused on that short-term thing, we actually start eating the seed corn. And I think that's what's happened as just globally. We've done that. So I think it's incumbent upon us as Christians to have an eternal perspective. That's news, huh? and kind of think about the long term and even in human history in terms of centuries instead of decades, and think about maybe establishing a household enterprises that last for generations.
So on that note of generational households, one of the stories that I always credit you when I steal it, but from Household in the War of the Cosmos, when you are comparing Aeneas and Abraham and the sort of clash of households, I think one of the most powerful things there is that you point out the intergenerational, the multi-generational nature of the promise to Abraham, the multi-generational promise to Aeneas, and the fact that both of those multi-generational promises promised inheritance of the earth. Therefore, these two stories, these two households were going to come into conflict. And I mean, when I was reading that Household in the War for the Cosmos, because I'm an English nerd, that my undergraduate degree is in English literature. I mean, joy was just seeping out. And then when you pointed out the fact that Paul comes along and heals a man named Aeneas in Acts, I thought, God writes the best stories. But lest I get too distracted, one of the things I thought was really interesting is that Aeneas gets this shield, this magical shield that's sort of emblazoned with the perpetual victories of his children's children's children. And I think one of the things that it seems like a lot of parents have lost, or a lot of households have lost, is the ability to think about multi-generational faithfulness, right? The proverb that tells righteous men to build an inheritance for their children seems to be lower on the priority preaching scale as justification by faith. And so, what have we lost in terms of what, or I guess maybe part of my question is, what do you think is at the root cause of churches kind of losing sight of multi-generational faithfulness?
Wow. I think partly it has to do with just being saturated with a culture of individualism that we find ourselves in. And so when we engage in evangelism, it's all about the person we're talking about. We're not talking about the larger picture. We're not talking about the kingdom of God. We're not talking about how their households fit into a larger story. Households for many, many people in sort of what is referred to as Big Eva, are basically, they're kind of like the Walmarts of religion, and there's a department for everybody and everything, and it's all about coming away with something that makes you feel good about yourself. The households that I've seen that have really done a good job of passing on the a vision for the kingdom of God is households that have it and talk to their kids about it. So, it's not so much, Jimmy, you need to get your heart right with Jesus so you can go to heaven, although that's completely true. Oftentimes it's, Jimmy, this is what we as a household are about, and you're an important part of that. We really want you to own it and be and carry this thing forward. I know of households that have 10, 12, 13 kids, and they're all believers, and it's because they had a sense that this is not all about them. This is what we're about as a family and a household.
That's a really good insight. I think it kind of comes back to your initial statement that households used to know what they were about. So one of the things I'll often tell families when they have we have families who will come to our church and their kids are already teenagers and they've been in public education before they were ever at a church that told them don't do that, and their kids are sort of lost in the LGBT stuff and whatever. And one of the first things I'll tell the father of the household is, one of the reasons you're losing your kids here is because you've failed to tell them a better story than the world is telling them about themselves, right? They've been caught up in this story that they can self-identify, they can choose who they are, and that's an attractive story to them, and you have to tell them a better story. And so what do you think in terms of, even going back to Aeneas and Abraham, one of the parts in the book is you talk about their mission statements. What do you think about mission statements, about, intentionally putting something in front of your family that if I asked, 16-year-old Jimmy or 6-year-old Sally, they both understand what the household is about? How do you teach your people this?
Yeah, well, I think yes, to answer the one part of the question is yes, you need to have that. Of course, you don't want it to just be your own sort of personal ego trip thing.
Yeah.
It needs to be derived from God's word, and they can see that your household is not an end in itself, but it is as well a part of a much bigger thing. When they really believe that, then they have a better understanding of who they are and what's expected of them. A lot of the weirdness that we see in the world today is people trying to make it up on the fly because they've never had anybody give them a sort of a compelling case for, see yourself this way. It's been basically get in touch with your feelings, follow your passions. If your passions happen to take you into some really dangerous and weird stuff, well, we'll just affirm you. It's just nuts. We trust our passions, and in antiquity, both in the biblical traditions and and in the classical world, your passions were like your least reliable source of guidance. They were the things that got you into trouble. And now we're telling everybody that they should trust this stuff. But I think that if you are able to tie it in, so like when you think about Deuteronomy chapter 6, what you have there is, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, mind, and strength. But also you've got, talk to your children when you get up, when you lie down, when you go out, on the way, when you come home. It's just part of your life. It's something you're doing all the time. By the way, the weird thing is my most productive, I think many of my most productive conversations with my kids when they were growing up is when we were driving somewhere. So it's almost like, they felt like maybe it was a little more, I guess, a little less intimidating talking to Dad when he wasn't looking at him. I'd be having to look down the road where we're going. That's right. That's right. And so we just talk, they would bring up stuff that I was like, what? And we'd get into it. So you talk about that kind of stuff. And then you talk a lot, about how, their own lives kind of fit into that. So today, my kids are all grown. I've got grandchildren. Each of the kids are married and have households of their own. And it's just a lot of fun to be with them. So like I'm in Connecticut right now. So I saw 3 of my granddaughters last night. And that was a lot of fun. Getting to this, one of my granddaughters, Olive, she's 2. She was so excited to see me because she wanted to show me her boots, for one thing, her pink boots that she wears when she goes out to feed the chickens. And so she wanted to show me the chickens too. Like I'd never seen chickens in my life before. But anyway, so I went out there and she was just like, that's right. So I'm Pop. That's what the kids would call me. Pop. I could hear her screaming it inside the house. Pop's here. But anyway, but the thing, what was she excited about? She was excited about doing something that was important. Gathering the eggs, taking care of the chickens, this kind of stuff. And my son and my daughter-in-law, her parents, that son is a foreman in a steel firm here in Hartford, and is a welder and works as a blacksmith and stuff like that. So he's got all kinds of stuff going on. but their household is a productive place just all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, I really found it insightful when you said about giving kids meaningful work helps them be attached to the family mission and whatnot. So how do we do that in the church? So a lot of our listeners are pastors, elders, leaders in the church, but even some good faithful churches have a hard time giving kids in the church meaningful work to do in the church ministry. So how do we start in fostering and promoting this in the church, because obviously what we do in the church should be modeled in all the households, right?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that pastors have something of a leg up on other people is that we never lost sort of the productive household. And what I mean by that is, so let's put it this way. So let's say I was being interviewed to fill, the role of a pastor in a particular church. And in the course of the interview, I'm asked, "Tell us about your wife," and I responded, "What does she have to do with it?" I'm the one you're paying, right? I mean, she's got her own life. By the way, she's an atheist. She doesn't come to church. Would I get the job? No,
I hope not. Because depends on where you're applying.
Is it a United church?
Right. Right. But you get the drift. Basically, if that question were asked at any, say, secular corporation, tell us about your wife or tell us about your husband, people would say, what does that have to do with my working for you?
Yeah.
We still, within, the pastorate, we still have this understanding that at least everybody in the household should be a believer.
That's right.
But beyond that, when I would talk to my kids, it wasn't hard for them to see that the work of the church was something that not just I was taken up with, but my wife was taken up with as well. And there were a set of expectations. There was obviously just the minimal behavioral expectations, support your father, don't, go out and live crazed, life, that kind of stuff. But also be involved in the ministries of the church, play a role as a leader in the group that you find yourself in, and help out. So, there are a range of things, that typically are places where kids can get involved, music and helping out in different programs and so forth. And that's the case for my kids.
There's sort of a direction that I wanted to take, and so I do want to, Chris, you brought up a good point, and I do think that there are certain things that ancient households had that we no longer have, and taking some of these things back, taking back education, though it requires sacrifice, we get how that works, right? Go down to one income, mom go home, educate the kids, right? But there's some things like healthcare. It's a little bit harder. There's some regulations that you can't do. You can't do certain things that you once could do. So I want to talk a little bit about how the church can help families take back some of their responsibilities. But just before we get there, so that just helps you know where I'm going in my mind here. But before we get there, I think one of the other things you've been talking about, a productive home. And one of the things that I know you've written about quite often that I think ties in with this idea is sort of anti-fragile homes. So we're obviously coming out of a great shakeup in the Western world after COVID, and I think that families are recognizing, whether it's the hike in interest rates, whether it's pandemics that affect work and education, I think families recognize, and hopefully a lot of churches recognize, that when the world starts shaking around you, the stronger your household is, the less affected you are by the craziness of the world. So maybe talk a little bit about, we're talking about reclaiming certain things, but how do we insulate our homes from the craziness in the culture around us? How do we make them anti-fragile?
Yeah, that's great to reflect on. I think different phases of life, present you with different possibilities. One of the things that you want to do is, as much as is possible, get a stronger hold on the means of your livelihood that you rely on. No, so I'm a pastor. Obviously, I'm cared for by my congregation, and it was important for me over the years to make certain that I was serving a church that I was on the same page with when it came to philosophy of ministry and many of the things we're talking about here. And as I developed over the course of those years, my convictions about this became more and more evident that that's something that I should work toward. So I'm at a church right now as a pastor where, I mean, the level of agreement is approaching 100% with my elders and stuff, and so a lot of the people I work with are actually business owners and so forth. But then when it comes to my coming closer to home, I have several sources of ancillary income. So one of the things that prompted this years ago, I found myself in a denomination that I could see was trending woke, and I didn't want to be any part of that. And so we didn't call it woke back in those days. This was like the days of the emergent church and all that kind of stuff. So we didn't use the term woke, but I could see that things were going in a direction that I was uncomfortable going along with things. And so I didn't resign my church overnight, but I began to build my exit strategy, develop my exit strategy. And so I got involved in real estate. I had already been involved to a small degree. I had, a multifamily, but over the course of about probably 5 or 6 years, I was able to build up a portfolio where I had 18 rental units and I was pretty well anti-fragile at that point in a certain respect, at least for my denomination. Obviously, nothing is fully anti-fragile. Things can happen that can undermine even the best laid plans of mice and men, as they say. But so I was also a college professor part-time, and man, I look back in those days and I think, how did I do it? There was just so much I was involved with. I was like constantly on the run. And my church was growing too. We would gone to 2 services and had a $1 million building program. And then I had actually overseen it as the general contractor. It was just nuts. Now I'm an old man. Now I'm an old man and I'm like, I don't have that kind of energy. But at the time I had a lot of energy. But now I'm at a stage of life where my kids are all kind of involved with the different ventures, and I'm interacting with them all the time about these different things. So like my second son manages our rental properties, and my oldest son works with me on all of my intellectual property stuff. So I'm interacting with them, and we're all gainfully deriving some income from these things. So. But that's the phase of life I'm in right now. And what did I have it in mind that it would work out this way? Nah, kind of, but not exactly. It was sort of like it just kind of organically developed. Now they've got other things they do, but we still work together. So the anti-fragility there at this stage of life is not just simply the multiple streams of income. Between my wife and I think we have 9 income streams. But it's also just the fact that we've got this sort of extended household network where everybody's got a role and we're working together.
Yeah, I think that's something that's really profound, is that the idea of like when you become anti-fragile, whether that's in you're able to raise chickens or you're able to get incomes coming from different strains, it actually helps you stay faithful because you're no longer tied to like, oh, what if I lose my pension over here, or if my denomination goes woke. You were able to leave a denomination that you saw the writing on the wall down the road because it wasn't like, oh, well, what about my pension? What about my income? Because you have other avenues and other ways to make food on the table. Because I would say one of the things we saw over COVID, at least in Canada, was a lot of people who would otherwise have been with us went the other way because they're like, well, what about, I'm going to lose my pension. I got to put food on the table. And those are real concerns for men, particularly even men who are thinking like, well, I have to feed my wife, my kids. Yeah. But being anti-fragile allows you to stay faithful when you see the writing on the wall. So that's really, really good. And the other thing I thought was awesome there is that one of the things we hear a ton about in our society is fatherlessness. And fatherlessness is obviously immediately goes to our brain of like, dad isn't in the home, but it's also an absence of father, period. Like, because dad's always, out in the factory. And you just described, you have multiple income streams, but you work with your son in one of them and you work with your other son in the other one. And it's like, well, even at your, like a more experienced age, you're now able to take less work in terms of like the physical doing it, because your boys are there doing, and like you're there to shepherd them. So they're not fatherless, even though they're in their 40s or whatnot. They're like, it's just a beautiful picture of like, and I think Nate, you said it, this is the better story. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like that's
right.
what we need to cultivate.
Yeah.
I don't know if there was a question in there, but
yeah, that's all great stuff. I agree with you completely. And the women in our household are also very engaged. So, for example, here we just went over to the UK. We did a tour of Oxford with the podcast I'm a part of, and my oldest son, did all of the audio and video for that. But his wife, she was pretty much the person who took care of all the logistics, and she's got this marvelous way about her that it makes it possible for us to connect with people that I don't think we would have connected any other way. It's hard to say no to my daughter-in-law Whitney.
It's a great skill.
And so she would. That's right. It is. So she was able to get us interviews with people I didn't think we'd be able to get interviews with, and that kind of stuff. We paid her.
It's good.
We should hire her.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, it's great. So, I guess just kind of two questions left, and we'll bring this back to the big theme of this series with the last question. But first, I want to just kind of ask so you've obviously thought through these things as a father, as a leader in your home, as a pastor, as a influencer, if you don't hate that term. And so I guess part of my question is, how have you steered your church in such a way that it helps individual families reclaim some of these things that we're talking about? How can a church help? Because like I said, education is one thing. It takes sacrifice. Preach it faithfully from the pulpit. Encourage your people to go down to one income and do it, and the fathers to get anti-fragile and get other streams of revenue, all that kind of stuff. That's easy to say, hard to do. But what about welfare? What about healthcare? What about some of these things that are maybe too hard for an individual household to begin to take back? How can the church come and become that household of households where you're taking something back collectively as a community?
Yeah, that's great. One of the things that you see, I think, in healthy churches is kind of extended networks that organically develop. So I'm always surprised at what's going on in my church. And I mean in a positive way.
Yeah, that's a good thing.
That's right. You can be surprised in a negative way. But I know that often when we develop programs, our intents are really good. Our intentions are good. But I think there's a cost that is incurred when we're always trying to create a system that we can manage and control. And the cost is that people become passive, and they expect the program to take care of things. Whereas if you just have sort of kind of a set of healthy networks, you can see a lot of things addressed at a pretty in a pretty healthy way. Now, you can't scale that up too far. If we were talking about taking care of people who maybe are indigent or people who are chronically unemployed or something like that, then you're going to have to get a lot more structure. And I don't have much experience with that. But I know that there are churches and traditions that do that. I think one of the things that people are perhaps unaware of is just how vigorous the Mormons are on this particular matter score. They have kind of a parallel welfare system that people don't know about, and in that welfare system, they are able to exercise a whole lot more moral direction with people than, say, our federal government in the United States can. The Amish are the same way. So there are these communities that take a much more proactive approach. And I think that, one of the things that we're seeing with, sort of this transition that we've experienced over the last, say, 20 years that Aaron Wren has talked about, or Rod Dreher, is that we're going to have to bring back, we're not going to be able to just kind of hand over our interests to the state and to other secular institutions as much as we've tended to in the past. There was still a kind of latent Christianity that we could rely on being, influential with those institutions. That's pretty much all gone. So it's going to force us to be more intentional, like these other groups have been.
Yeah, that's really good. So just one more question for you then, and this is maybe kind of getting into some of the big themes of In the House of Tom Bombadil, which is a great book, and Chris plugged you pretty hard. You should get Chris to cut a promo video for that book. I think you'll sell lots. But I guess my question is, why is it that step one for winning the world is taking dominion of your home?
Yeah. Well, I'm really glad that you wanted to zero in on that book. That book is intended to address the nature of dominion and contrast it with domination. So the two words obviously have the same root, but I think we know that there's an important difference between the two. But sometimes I think we lose sight of that difference. Sometimes I think fathers in their enthusiasm for dominion become like Saran or Saruman in terms of how they sort of like work with their families and so forth. Whereas I think Tom Bombadil is an exemplar of what dominion should look like, kind of the joviality of the father. When we hear the word Jove, where we get the word jovial from, was the father of the gods in the Roman pantheon. And people don't associate joviality with him because they think of him as just this angry guy that's always throwing lightning bolts at people. But actually, he was pretty fun guy to be around. Apparently, he had his bad days, but generally speaking, he was, I think, sort of kind of the Roman understanding of the father. A father and so, one of the best things a father can do for his home is be jovial, give a sense of approval and affection and regard to his children. Now, that doesn't mean you're a pushover or you're a buddy dad or something like that and always overlooking stuff. Obviously, Jove had another side. He knew how to bring the lightning. That's right. But generally speaking, your joviality is your blessing on the house. This is a great place to be. I love all of you people. We're working together. This is great. And your wife is one of the primary beneficiaries of that. When you have a jovial spirit, like you see, and I think really marvelously personified with Tom Bombadil.
Yeah, that's awesome.
That's great.
Yeah, no, that's I think a lot of times when we talk about obviously a word we didn't even get to, but it's laced throughout Household and War for the Cosmos, the term piety, which I think you do a good job of making great again. And I think that duty. Some of these words, I think they speak to the masculine spirit in a way that gets us to straighten our backs and put our shoulders back, and that's a good thing. But the reminder to do so with joy, right? To do so jovially, right? To do so with a whole lot of laughing and playfulness and tickle fights in the house is a really good is a really good reminder and probably a really good way for us to cap off this episode. So if you appreciated this content, like I said again, I would just point you to C.R. Wiley in general. If you're not familiar with his content, listen to Theology Pugcast, still one of my favorite podcasts to listen to regularly. But those three books that we mentioned. Man of the House, very, very practical in terms of fathers being productive in the home. Household and the War for the Cosmos, reclaiming duty, piety within the home. And in the House of Tom Bombadil, which is really about dominion starting on the inside of the home and working its way out into the world. So that's the order. Read them, and hopefully you've been helped by this. Pastor Wiley, where else can people find you? Where can they read your writing? I know you blog at a few places. Where can they find your content?
Well, I've got a website that I never use. So if somebody wants to go there and look at pictures of books that were published, so that's crwiley.com. But I'm on social media, like everybody. I do write fairly regularly for Touchstone Magazine, where I'm a senior editor, and for World Magazine, where I contribute to the op-ed page pretty often. They've asked me now to come on to the physical magazine and be a contributor to the book review section. So I'll be there probably on a regular basis. But those are some places.
Speaking of books, when's the next book coming out?
Well, I've gotten advance for a book that I is supposed to have done by now, so I better get it done pretty quick.
I know at one point you were working on, or at least teasing, a book called How to Fight Communism in Your Spare Time. Is that still in the works?
That's the one I got some money for, so I better finish that one up. But it's taken some interesting turns. So I'm going to be speaking at the annual Touchstone Conference, and the theme of the talk is the book.
Okay,
so,
that's great. All right. Well, we'll look forward to that.
Can't wait.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, Pastor Wiley. This was a really helpful conversation for us. I hope it was edifying for all of our listeners. We hope that your ministry continues to be blessed, and that people continue to interact with the material that you've put out there. And we hope that our listeners utilize this information, as with all of the information in this series, to help affect change in the world around them. So until next time, we're the Rebels, and we'll see you next week.